So Canada just blocked America's pharmaceutical supply chain, and millions of Americans are about to find out their prescription drugs come from a country their president started a trade war with. Prime Minister Carney announced at 8 a.m. this morning that Canada is suspending all pharmaceutical exports to the United States. Active ingredients, finished generics, insulin intermediaries, the CROSPR pharmacy pipeline, effective in 72 hours. Every American pharmacy chain just got a countdown clock. Trump's response was immediate. And when I tell you what he did, the military orders, the rhetoric, the comparison to a hostile act of war against a NATO ally, you'll understand why the Pentagon pushed back, why NATO headquarters went into emergency session, and why Warren Buffett said something about the American healthcare system that stopped a room full of billionaires cold. When you hear which drugs are affected, how fast the shortages will hit, and what Buffett revealed about the pharmaceutical dependency that nobody in Washington wanted to talk about, you'll understand why this is about to hit a lot closer to home than any tariff fight ever has. Hit subscribe. This one is personal. Let me walk you through exactly what happened. Carney held the press conference in Ottawa at 8 a.m. Eastern. He stood behind the podium, flanked by his ministers, his tone calm, measured, completely devoid of emotion. Canada has been a reliable pharmaceutical partner to the United States for over 50 years. We have supplied active ingredients, manufactured generic drugs, processed insulin compounds, and provided affordable prescription access to millions of American citizens. We did this as partners, as neighbors, as allies, but we cannot continue to supply the healthcare needs of a nation whose government treats us as an economic adversary. The legal mechanism is something most Americans have never heard of. 2 months ago, Canada quietly passed the Essential Goods Sovereignty Act, emergency legislation giving the Prime Minister authority to restrict exports of goods deemed essential to Canadian national interest. It barely made the news in the United States. Nobody on Capitol Hill paid attention. Nobody in the White House flagged it. 2 months later, it just became the most consequential piece of legislation in North American trade relations. The scope of the suspension is total. Active pharmaceutical ingredients, finished generic medications, insulin intermediary compounds, bulk chemical precursors, CROSPR pharmacy shipments, every category of pharmaceutical export from Canada to the United States, suspended in 72 hours, not reduced, not renegotiated. Carney didn't raise his voice. He read the statement, took 3 questions, and left. The restraint was the point. This wasn't emotional, it was surgical. The market reaction was immediate and violent. Pharmaceutical stocks cratered within minutes. Major generics manufacturers dropped 8 to 12% before noon. CVS, Walgreens, and Raid all issued emergency statements. Hospital systems across the northern United States activated shortage protocols. The American Pharmacist Association released an emergency advisory listing 47 critical drugs at immediate risk of shortage. Within an hour, hospital procurement officers across the northern half of the country were on the phone with every alternative supplier they could find. India, Ireland, Israel all got calls. Most of those calls ended the same way. We can't replace Canadian supply. Not at this volume, not at this speed. India's generic industry could scale up, but the lead time is months, not days. Ireland's pharmaceutical sector produces patented brand name drugs, not the generic APIs American manufacturers depend on. Israel's tea could redirect some supply, but not enough to close the gap. The math simply doesn't work. Canada's pharmaceutical supply chain wasn't one option among many. It was the foundation. And here's the detail that makes this even more unsettling. The 72-hour window Carney announced isn't a negotiating window. It's a logistics window. It gives American distributors exactly enough time to place emergency orders on whatever existing inventory Canadian companies still have in transit. Shipments already on trucks, already at airports, already in the pipeline. But it's not enough time to find, qualify, and onboard alternative suppliers. 72 hours is enough to panic. This is Carney's direct response to Trump's latest tariff escalation. A 35% surcharge on Canadian manufactured goods announced the previous week. But Canada didn't do this without warning. There were 3 separate diplomatic communications over 2 months, each escalating in severity. The first was polite, the second was firm, the third was explicit. If the tariffs on manufactured goods proceed, we will restrict pharmaceutical exports. The tariffs proceeded, the restriction followed. Nobody in Washington can say they weren't warned. Let's start with active pharmaceutical ingredients, because this is where the whole thing begins. APIs are the raw chemical compounds that become finished drugs, the actual active molecules that make your medication work. Without the API, there is no pill, there is no injection, there is no treatment. Canada is the largest processor of active pharmaceutical ingredients in North America. Facilities in Montreal, Toronto, and Calgary handle API purification and formulation for dozens of generic drugs sold in American pharmacies. Apotex, the Canadian generics giant, supplies API compounds to dozens of American drug manufacturers. When Apotex stops shipping, the American companies that buy those compounds can't make finished pills. The production lines slow, then they stop. And these aren't specialty drugs for rare conditions. These are the most prescribed medications in the United States. Metformin, 90 million American prescriptions per year for diabetes. Linapril, 104 million for blood pressure. Atorvastatin, 94 million for cholesterol. Amoxicillin, one of the most commonly prescribed antibiotics in the country. These are the drugs that half of American adults over 50 take every single day. But that's not even the most terrifying part, because now we need to talk about insulin. 37 million Americans have diabetes. Of those, 8.4 million require insulin to survive, not to manage symptoms, to survive. Without insulin, a type 1 diabetic can go into diabetic ketoacidosis within days and die within weeks. This is not a lifestyle medication. This is a lifeline. Novo Nordisk's Canadian manufacturing facility in Mississauga produces insulin distributed throughout the North American market. Eli Lilly sources critical intermediary compounds from Canadian suppliers. Santa's Canadian operations feed directly into the continental insulin supply chain. These three companies control the vast majority of the global insulin market, and all three have significant Canadian dependencies. Current U.S. insulin inventory sits at approximately 4 to 6 weeks of supply at normal distribution rates. If Canadian insulin exports stop for 72 hours, hospitals start rationing within 3 weeks. If they stop for 30 days, people start dying. That is not hyperbole. That is what endocrinologists are telling the Department of Health and Human Services right now. The American insulin market has no rapid alternative. Domestic production capacity covers roughly 40% of demand. The rest is imported, with Canada as the primary North American source. There is no switch to flip, no backup supplier sitting in a warehouse. America does not make enough insulin to keep its own diabetics alive. That is the sentence that should terrify every policymaker in Washington. And until this morning, almost none of them knew it. And the cruelty of an insulin shortage is that it doesn't hit everyone equally. Wealthy diabetics will stockpile. They'll pay whatever it costs. They'll fly to Europe if they have to. But the single mother in Toledo making $38,000 a year, already paying $300 a month out of pocket for her son's insulin, she can't stockpile. She can't fly to Europe. She's the one who shows up at the pharmacy and hears the words no parent ever wants to hear. We're on back order. We don't know when it's coming in. That's not an economic statistic. That's a mother standing in a CVS trying not to cry. And then there's the cross-spur pharmacy pipeline, the one that hits the most vulnerable Americans hardest. Millions of Americans, especially seniors, uninsured workers, and underinsured families, buy their prescription drugs from Canadian pharmacies because the exact same medications cost 50 to 80% less across the border. States like Florida, Maine, Vermont, Colorado, and New Hampshire have formal state-authorized Canadian drug importation programs. The informal market is even larger. Online Canadian pharmacies serving millions of American customers who simply cannot afford American drug prices. When Carney shut down pharmaceutical exports, he cut off the affordable drug pipeline that millions of Americans, most of them elderly, most on fixed incomes, depend on to afford their medication. a retired teacher in Bangor, Maine, making $1,800 a month on Social Security, paying $420 a month for 3 prescriptions at a U.S. pharmacy, or $86 for the same drugs from a Canadian pharmacy. That's the difference between eating and not eating, between heating the house and not heating the house. And that lifeline just went dark. Now, Warren Buffett responded to all of this, and his reaction was unlike anything we've heard from him in this entire trade war. He was at a health care industry conference in Omaha. When a moderator asked him about the Canadian pharmaceutical blockade, he paused, a long pause, and then he said this: "You know, I've talked a lot this year about capital flows and trade balances. I'm comfortable with numbers, but this isn't about numbers anymore. This is about a 67-year-old woman in Dayton, Ohio, who needs insulin to stay alive and whose supply just became a bargaining chip in a tariff dispute." I don't have a Foley way to say this. That's morally obscene. Morally obscene. Those are the 2 strongest words Warren Buffett has used in the entirety of this trade conflict. Not strategically unwise, not economically irrational, morally obscene. The Oracle of Omaha just made a moral judgment. He continued, "How did the most powerful country on earth end up dependent on a neighbor for its own medicine supply? We spent 30 years letting pharmaceutical companies offshore production wherever the margins were highest. We let the supply chain stretch across borders because it was cheaper. And nobody ever asked, what happens if that supply gets cut off? Well, now we know. Every president before this one managed to maintain the relationship with the country that supplies our medicine. It took a trade war to turn a supply chain vulnerability into a supply chain crisis. The vulnerability existed for decades. The crisis was manufactured in 18 months. Then he said something about Trump's response that encapsulated the absurdity. I heard about the president's response, the National Guard, the Defense Production Act, the rhetoric about hostile military action. You can't point a soldier at a pharmaceutical compound. You can't invoke emergency powers and make insulin appear. The only way to get Canadian pharmaceutical exports flowing again is to sit down with Canada and negotiate. Everything else is theater. He finished with this. When your trade policy starts threatening people's access to medicine, when a diabetic in Ohio becomes a casualty of a tariff dispute, you've crossed the line. And I don't know how you come back from that. That last sentence landed differently than anything Buffett has said before. A 94-year-old man who has seen every crisis American capitalism has produced over 7 decades, admitting he doesn't have a framework for what's happening now. Now let's talk about what Trump did. Because Buffett was right. It was theater, but it was also dangerous. Trump's response came at 2:15 p.m. Eastern. He held a press conference in the Rose Garden, flanked by the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Health and Human Services. The staging alone told you this was being framed as a national security response. He announced 3 actions simultaneously. First, a National Guard deployment to the northern border. 3,200 troops ordered to staging areas along the New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and Washington state borders. The stated mission, protecting American health security interests. Second, an invocation of the Defense Production Act, ordering American pharmaceutical companies to maximize domestic production immediately. Third, a formal diplomatic classification of Canada's pharmaceutical export ban as an act of economic warfare equivalent to a hostile military action against the American people. Think about what you just heard. The President of the United States just compared Canada, America's closest ally, the longest undefended border in the world, a NATO founding partner, a country that has fought beside American soldiers in every major conflict since World War I, to a hostile military adversary because Canada stopped shipping pills. The National Guard. Deployment was designed for one audience. Television cameras. Soldiers at the border looks decisive. It looks strong. It looks like a president taking action, but it doesn't produce a single milligram of insulin. It doesn't restart a single API shipment. It doesn't unclog a single supply chain bottleneck. Military analysts pointed out within hours that there is no supply chain infrastructure to protect at the border. Pharmaceutical exports flow through commercial shipping, air cargo, and truck freight, not through checkpoints that soldiers can guard. You can't intercept a pharmaceutical supply chain disruption with camouflage and rifles. It's a photo op dressed up as a policy. The northern border has been demilitarized since the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817. Over 200 years of peace across the longest undefended border in the history of the modern world. And it just got soldiers who can't do anything about the problem they were sent to address. The Defense Production Act invocation was even more revealing. Trump ordered American pharmaceutical manufacturers to surge domestic production. The problem is that American manufacturers can't surge production because they depend on Canadian active pharmaceutical ingredients to make the drugs. It's like ordering a bakery to make more bread while cutting off their flour supply. The oven works fine, the recipe is ready, but there's no flour and the flour is in Canada. Pharmaceutical industry executives explained this to the White House within hours. One CEO reportedly told a senior advisor, "You're asking us to make pills without ingredients. We physically cannot do what you're ordering. The molecules we need are in Canada." The response, "The president wants action, not excuses." The people who understand pharmaceutical supply chains told the White House this wouldn't work. The White House told them to make it work anyway. That's not leadership, that's denial. And the hostile military action language may be the most damaging element of all. NATO headquarters called an emergency consultation within 2 hours. The concern wasn't about Canada. The concern was about what this means for every other alliance. If America classifies Canada as equivalent to a hostile military actor over a pharmaceutical export dispute, what does that mean for Japan, for Germany, for the UK, for any country that has an economic disagreement with Washington, Japan, Germany, Australia, and the UK? All issued statements within hours expressing what diplomats call concern, which in diplomatic language means alarm. When you call your closest ally a hostile military actor, you've told every ally on earth that their alliance with the United States is conditional, fragile, and one trade dispute away from being classified as hostility. Every ambassador in Washington heard that message. Every foreign ministry in the world updated their threat assessments. The fallout is already cascading. Within hours, hospital procurement systems across the northern United States activated shortage protocols. The Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, and Mass General all issued internal memos about potential drug rationing timelines. Generic antibiotic supplies 3 to 4 weeks, insulin 4 to 6 weeks before rationing. Chemotherapy compounds with Canadian-sourced APIs, some as little as 2 weeks. A cancer patient at Memorial Sloan Kettering doesn't care about tariff policy. They care about whether their next chemotherapy infusion is going to be available. And right now, the procurement team at that hospital cannot guarantee it will be. We're not talking about trade deficits or stock market fluctuations. We're talking about whether a cancer patient gets their treatment, whether a diabetic gets their insulin, whether a child with an ear infection gets antibiotics. That's what this trade war just became. CVS announced it would begin limiting prescription quantities to 30-day supplies. Walgreens activated its critical shortage contingency. State-authorized Canadian importation programs in Florida, Maine, and Vermont all frozen. Millions of seniors who depended on affordable Canadian drugs are now facing full American prices overnight. A 90-day supply of brand name insulin in the United States costs approximately $900. The same supply from a Canadian pharmacy costs $120. That $780 difference per quarter is now hitting the budgets of retired Americans on fixed incomes, people who structured their lives around the assumption that they could get their medication affordably from across the border. The people hurt worst by this aren't wealthy or powerful. They're elderly people on Social Security who ordered online to afford their medication, and they just became collateral damage. Carney's conditions are straightforward. Full tariff rollback on Canadian manufactured goods plus withdrawal of Guard deployments equals pharmaceutical exports resume within 48 hours. Trump's position, no rollback, no withdrawal. Pharmaceutical exports must resume unconditionally. There's a simple deal available. Remove the tariffs, remove the soldiers, the medicine flows. Carney has said it plainly, publicly, with no ambiguity. But that deal requires Trump to admit the tariffs were a mistake. And his entire brand is built on the premise that he never backs down, never apologizes, never concedes. Every previous off-ramp in this trade war has been rejected for the same reason. Not because the terms were unacceptable, because accepting terms means acknowledging error. So the hospitals plan for rationing. The pharmacies limit prescriptions. The seniors calculate whether they can afford their medication. Endocrinologists start making lists of which patients get insulin first. Oncologists have conversations with patients about whether their next round of chemotherapy can be guaranteed. This is about medicine. Your medicine, your family's medicine, the pills in your cabinet, the prescriptions at your pharmacy, the treatments in your hospital. A trade war that started with tariffs on steel just reached into your medicine cabinet. And the president's response isn't negotiation. It's soldiers at the border. How long before drug shortages move from procurement memos to empty pharmacy shelves? Can Trump's military posturing survive the reality that you cannot force a sovereign nation to ship you medicine at gunpoint? And the question Buffett couldn't answer when a trade policy starts threatening people's access to medicine. How do you come back from that? What do you say to the family in Ohio whose insulin supply just became a bargaining chip? The tariffs were supposed to make America stronger. The pharmaceutical blockade just proved how vulnerable America really is. Canada didn't need to send a single soldier. They just stopped shipping medicine. And the most powerful country on earth is now scrambling to keep its own people healthy without the help of the neighbor it picked a fight with. The clock is ticking.